The time is just gone 10 minutes past 8 as we kick off this morning, taking a look at budget cuts, non-profit organizations, NPOs having financial difficulties. And this morning, we are joined by Research Associate at Wits University, Lisa Vetten. Lisa, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Inyat, and good morning to your viewers, not listeners.
Well, Lisa, in the last few months, we've seen a number of reports with regard to budget cuts, particularly with regard to NPOs looking at issues like social development. And we've seen NPOs raising huge concerns, massive concerns. Although we've seen, like, for example, in Gauteng, we've seen the Gauteng Social Development denying budget cuts. We've seen people like the Premier, Panyaza Lesuvi, saying, don't panic. Because NGOs or NPOs budgets have been slashed. Now, clearly, this is a huge problem. It is an area of concern considering the vital services that NPOs provide.
Yes. So the important information around the budget cuts is obtained in the budget vote for the Gauteng province, specifically the Department of Social Development. So in April, when the new financial year started, analyzing the budget vote showed that 415 million had been cut from NPOs. And that had a big impact on child protection services, on services to people with HIV and AIDS, to older persons, and to people with disabilities. So that is when you can see, if you remember, there were a number of protests. That was when the Premier stepped in and said, no, there'll be a rethink. There's been that the department had misinterpreted his recommendation that the budget be reprioritized. Because what had happened was that money had been taken from the services I described to a program called Research and Development that predominantly focuses on things like cooperatives, sewing of school uniforms, creation of dignity packs, and waste management projects. So he said, no, the money must come back. So most organizations did get their funding back, but from what we've seen, all did not. So many older persons' luncheon clubs, and for some older persons, that's the only meal they'll get the whole day, have still not received their funding. Many of the services in the HIV sector have also still not received their funding. But now we're also worried about next year, because if you look at the budget vote, it's very clear that the cut was not only for this year, but it's again to be repeated next year. So yesterday there was a summit with NPOs and the MEC for Social Development and the Premier, where this was raised again, because this time organizations are not going to wait until the 5th of April, when the financial year has already started, to begin protesting. We're going to be making plans now to ensure that they're not put in the same position as they were last year, where staff suddenly find themselves without jobs, and where suddenly you have to tell people with disabilities they need to go home to their families who are not necessarily equipped to look after them, because you just have no money. You are not able to care for them any longer.
Well, Lisa, clearly there's a double whammy here because you look talking about people with disabilities and people that actually benefit as a result of the social services that are being provided by the NPOs, but also you're talking about job cuts as well
Mm.
because NPOs are not able to sustain themselves because we are led to believe that in some instances these budgets have been cut as much as 61%, and we've also heard about funding applications that have been declined.
Yes, that's correct. So in the child protection organizations, many of them had their funding cut by over 60%. And that was very unrealistic because they had 30% of their funding, but the department was expecting to deliver exactly the same amount of work as they had done last year, which is simply not possible. And on that 30% of funding, at most, with their savings, organizations calculated they would have lasted maybe 6 months, but others had already planned to start closing at the end of April. And that would have immediately left many people without jobs, and no retrenchment package either. I mean, we did an analysis of about 40 organizations, and between those 40 organizations, over 1,000 jobs had been lost, and 30,000 people had lost access to services, which is very severe. And you must bear in mind, to put this into context, that we're only talking about 40 organizations, and there are probably well over 1,000 organizations that are funded to provide social care services. So I think that might give you a sense of the scale of the impact that this would have had if it had been allowed to continue.
Yes, and also in just purely in terms of numbers, the number of people that are affected. And I know, for example, we're talking about people with disabilities. There are thousands upon thousands of people that are affected. We're not talking about any small number. And once again, this whole reprioritization of funds, obviously, and moving them to other departments. Again, where does this leave the Department of Social Services in terms of compassion, particularly where people are very, very vulnerable, Lisa?
Exactly. I mean, the department had said, "Oh no, they're in a position to take over child protection services," but we didn't see any indication of that, and this process wasn't followed in a particularly thoughtful way. I mean, if you are going, when somebody has developed a relationship with somebody through counselling or through foster care, or you've been caring for them because they're in a centre for disabilities, to suddenly say, okay, tomorrow I will never be seeing you ever again, is a massive shock to that person. Especially where, if abuse has been involved and a relationship of trust has been developed, if you suddenly break that, you once again encourage people to mistrust and think that that people cannot be relied on. So there was no warning, and it was done very suddenly, and it did not seem as if the department was in a position to be able to take over services, certainly not within the broader older persons, people with disability sector. And I think another group we also forget, and those are people who are in conflict with the law. So there are people who would have committed petty crimes, stealing baby food, for instance. And so to send somebody to prison for something like that is very, very counterproductive. You give that person a prison record, they're going to struggle to find work when they come out, which means you aggravate your employment difficulties. And secondly, they will have been exposed to people with much more serious involvement in criminality, and they may have, be influenced in ways that become very difficult when they leave prison. So all those people who are receiving diversion programs to stay out of prison, they would have lost services as well. And the thing that is forgotten here is that these sorts of cuts have knock-on effects. You increase unemployment in the NPO sector. You perhaps increase unemployment and unemployability of people who were receiving services. You now expect their families to care for them. In some instances, for instance, the breadwinner may be a single mother. Now, she will be put in a position where does she continue working and therefore leave her child or her family member with a disability or her elderly relative alone for the day and vulnerable? Or does she give up her job, which now puts everybody at risk because there's no income coming in? So, I mean, there was no thought of the larger effects that this decision would have had.
Yes, Lisa, just looking at, in the with these budget cuts and with the slashing of funding, are there any alternatives for the NPOs going to the private sector, raising funds on their own? And, are there any options?
Yes, I mean, many organizations have been doing that for a long time because they don't even get full funding from the Department of Social Development anyway. They only get a subsidy. So they have to, so the department doesn't even pay for the true full cost of the services. They still need to raise their funds from the private sector or from others. Now, South Africa, as everybody knows, has been in a very difficult financial situation since COVID. So that means that the private sector, for instance, is itself struggling and saying we can't afford to support you in the way we should. And also, the point is, if you previously had only 40 organizations asking for funds from the corporate sector, the kind of cuts that the department had advocated would have meant you now would have had 400 organizations. And obviously, that's not sustainable either. So again, one has to think about where would the organizations have found this funding from. So they've got this little window period now of 6 months to try and work with the department to persuade them that the route they're following makes no sense in any way. And in addition, I think to try and create awareness around broader society that we need to have a bigger discussion around who provides care in South Africa and how is care to be supported. And how are we going to make sure that people are not left in the position they were in April, when next year in April.
Well, Lisa, what you're saying makes a lot of sense because just last night I had a discussion right here on Salam Media. We were talking about the high unemployment in the country and how this is impacted on the social fabric of
Mm,
society in more ways than one. And this is exactly what you and I are actually talking about as
yeah.
a result of the economic woes of this country and the inability on the part of the government and the creation of jobs employing people, we are going to see more and more of these problems, of social problems, societal problems cropping up, particularly with regard to the youth, where we know that there is close on to 70% unemployment amongst the youth alone. So all of this, and the end result is it's social services, it's NPOs that are engaged in the services of social services that are going to be to suffer most.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I think we already started to see some of the impact of the social ills. We've seen reports of child malnutrition being on the increase. Again, not the time to be cutting NPO funding because many are providing food in a range of different places. We're looking at the increase in crime. Again, that often coincides with unemployment and very difficult social circumstances. So you really want to try and provide people as much support as possible during such very, very difficult times. We have very clear economic challenges because there is a real necessity to focus on being able to find young people employment. I mean, young people in their 20s, for instance, if you don't find them employment now and get them into jobs, they could spend the rest of their lives unemployed, which is a terrible way, I think, for someone to spend their life because that really is putting you into poverty. But it also has bigger consequences in the sense that that's going to be the government's tax base for the next 40 or so years. And if you're not having people who are working who can also contribute to your tax base, it means where you're going to have the money in future to build roads, to manage your hospitals, to continue providing your NPO services, to providing your courts, your police services, all the things that require a state to function. So there's a problem here that you're pointing to is much larger. That is the economic choices we've been making over the last few decades and the urgent need to revisit them and to think about how do we do something urgently here in order to address our economic circumstances and the way they're going to play out over the long term and to ensure that we protect people now, whether through providing some kind of economic support, but also that they get services. Because if not everybody is going to be able to work, older persons are not allowed to work, children are not allowed to work, and people with profound severe disabilities also cannot work. So we must accept there will always be people who need care, and it's our responsibility as a society to provide that care. So we can't just be focusing on the cash side of social services, ensuring people have grants and unemployment. We must also put money into care for people who are not able to work, but still remain full members of our society, entitled to the rights of citizenship that everybody else does have. And those rights include the right to services and care.
Lisa, I know we've been talking about Gauteng. Is this a national problem?
In all provinces, there have been cuts to budgets. They were not as severe as those that happened in Gauteng. And I think the concern to organizations was that the Gauteng Department of Social Development was encouraging other provinces to take over the child protection services from NPOs. That we do not want to see happening because there is not the capacity. What we need to see is that there are not enough services in relation to child protection as it is. What we want to see is government filling in the gaps, not taking over what already exists, but supplementing and expanding and extending services to those who don't have.
Yes, and just finally, we are in August, and it is Women's Month, and an aspect I know we've been talking about people with disabilities, we've been talking about child protection, but also gender-based violence and women and shelters for women that are suffering abuse, because that's another important, it's a vital service that needs attention.
Absolutely. And I think the only thing that saved services to women who'd experiencing violence this year was the fact that the president had made it a priority, because those organizations were told, shelters, for instance, that if this hadn't been a presidential priority, they too would have had very significant cuts. So they've been saved for a year, but if this ever falls off the presidential priority list, then they will be in exactly the same position. But I think the other important aspect to emphasize here is that overwhelmingly, the bulk of those who provide care services, the social workers, the social auxiliary services, the caregivers, are women. So when you have these kinds of budget cuts and these kinds of job losses, you are talking about a disproportionate impact on women. So yes, it will have an impact on men, but disproportionately, it will be women who are left unemployed. And it will be the expectation, it will be women who will give up their jobs and who will take over the unpaid caring work that the state has now shifted onto them. So I think when we look at social care services, it's important to understand them as being gendered in multiple ways. Firstly, many of those who use the services are women because women are poorer than men. Most of those who work in them are women and therefore have the poor pay and poor working conditions that are generally associated with care work. So you're also having that impact on work. And then those who are going to be providing the unpaid care services are again women. So I think in Women's Month, it's really, really important to think about this because it touches on aspects of women's employment, women's care, and women's need for care and support. So it's very much a gendered issue that we should be thinking about and paying a lot of attention to this month in Women's Month.
Well, Lisa, thank you very much for that and for your time with us this morning and for unpacking what you have. All the best to you, and please take care.
Thank you very much, Inez. Thank you to you too.
Lisa Vetten, research associate at Wits University, and against the background of the budget cuts from on social services, NPOs in particular, are going through some very, very difficult times. And once again, we need to reiterate, we need to reinforce the social ills in society to a large extent, and also at the same time looking at people that are most vulnerable, like people with disabilities, childcare. We spoke about Women's Month just shortly as well. So all of that put into context just tells us that again, prioritizing, the funding and redirecting some of this funding to other areas, and clearly we are on a ticking time bomb at this point in time. If we cannot take care of those who are vulnerable within our society. The time is just headed for 8:25 a.m. We're going to go for a break. We come back. We'll be joined by journalist and research scholar based in India, Asif Mujtaba.